thanks again for joining us. My name is Leah Gage. I am the Business Development Coordinator for Oiko Credit USA. We're very, very happy today to welcome Christopher Tan, or Happy as he is known to most people. He is Grameen Foundation's Regional CEO for Asia, and we're very, very pleased that he's joining us. He's joining us from the Philippines, where it's 10 p.m. his time, so thank you so much for taking the time, Happy. He's responsible for defining and executing Grameen Foundation's long-term strategy and overseeing its various innovation and replication projects in the region. And Happy has over 16 years of experience in development finance, nonprofit management, and public interest law. He worked for Shore Bank Advisory Services and the Local Initiatives Support Corporation in the United States and Salagan in the Philippines. He holds a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago and a JD from Ateneo in de Manila University in Manila. So Happy, without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Leah. So good morning, everyone. Just quickly on the Grameen Foundation, we are an international development organization that focuses on the information and financial needs of the poor. And we have, based on the name, a strong heritage in microfinance. But as the world has changed, we realized that in order to help poor women become successful businesswomen, we need not only credit, but different kinds of financial services, but also beyond that, the information and business networks so that their businesses can thrive and grow. So these are the things that we've been focusing on for the past few years. And some of the work that we've experienced through that has informed the work that we're doing for the poverty scorecard. So Leah, can you please go to the first slide? Next slide. Thanks. So just an overview of the presentation. There are three parts. One, we wanted to give a sense of why we are measuring poverty. It seems so straightforward or obvious for this kind of sector, but the interesting fact is that most people don't have that kind of metric. Second part, we want to get a sense of the different dimensions of poverty outreach, why it's important to look at both and not just one. And third, based on this lens, we are discovering certain challenges in the microfinance sector despite the successes of microfinance. Next slide, please. So most of the content of what I'm sharing with you this morning comes from a research that we commissioned along with Oiko Credit and two other intermediaries in the Philippines, the Microfinance Council of the Philippines and the Mindanao Microfinance Council, Mindanao being a region in the southern part of the country. It was written by three people. Professor Ron Chua is a professor of the Asian Institute of Management. Ms. Chona Sebastian is a professor of the Ateneo Business School. And Ms. Aya Silva is a program officer for the Grameen Foundation. The link that you see will bring you to the report. It's very straightforward, 30 pages, 60 if you count the appendices. So please, if you're interested, it's available on the web. Next slide, please. So why are we measuring poverty? We think the PPI, or the Progress Out of Poverty Index scorecard, is important because it keeps organizations that claim to serve the poor honest. When we have a mainstream business that they'd like to invest in and they claim that they are profitable, we don't just take their word for it. We insist on examining their financials. And it's not that we suspect them of being dishonest. Rather, we see financial health as so important that we need to independently verify their claims. On the other hand, when development organizations tell us that they are serving the poor, most of us don't usually inquire beyond the handful of anecdotal stories that show individual women becoming better off. This is in part because the sector has not historically agreed on common measures for poverty outreach and impact. The PPI, on the other hand, is starting to change the situation. More and more practitioners, service providers, and funders are recognizing the PPI as the main tool for verifying the claims of microfinance institutions around poverty outreach. Again, it's not that we necessarily think that these claims are untrue. We just think that social mission is too important to simply take for granted. Another point is that the importance of this verification becomes even more pronounced when we see that as MFIs, microfinance institutions, grow and try to gain as much or as large market share as quickly as possible, MFIs tend, like most other organizations, will tend to focus on borrowers that are easier to serve, cheaper to serve. And these borrowers tend to be the more financially stable borrowers. And then next point is that poverty measurement and other types of client-level data they're important because we need to start designing programs that are based on actual analysis of information and less dependent on conventional wisdom. I think about a year ago, there was this movie called Moneyball. And during the last elections, Nate Silver was one of the most popular people in the United States. And in both cases, what we're seeing there is this new level of empiricism that really looks at what we mean when we claim that the poor are able to do this or not able to do that, or that voters are going to vote this way or that way. People will have their opinions about it. And opinions are fine, except the question is, are they actually based on something that's empirically verifiable? And the fact is, historically, many of the programs and products and services that have been designed for poor people are based on certain ideas about them. And that's inevitable. But the question is, are these ideas based on information that can be empirically verified? So that's the importance of doing this work. Next slide, please. So there are different ways of measuring poverty. You can go through a very extensive survey, or you can go through these kinds of scorecards that we're doing. We chose to do a scorecard even if it will be not as nuanced and comprehensive as a full survey, because we really felt that if practitioners will not use the tool because it is too cumbersome to use, then it doesn't really matter how good or accurate or precise it is. So given that there will be these kinds of trade-offs, we decided might as well focus on something that will be used. So this scorecard is based on the National Poverty Incidence Survey of each country that we're focusing in. Say in one country you have a survey of 2,000 questions. We run a regression and we pick the 100 most predictive questions, predictive of whether they are going to be poor or not. And then of those 100 questions, we reduce it to 10 based on which ones are the most easily verifiable and which ones are the most culturally sensitive. And an example of that, and it's a very powerful predictor in most of the scorecards across the world, would be a question around the number of children in that household below the age of 14. So the higher the number, the more likely that that household is poor. So those are the types of questions that we have in this scorecard. There are 10 of them. And each question by itself is not really very important. It's not a specific indicator of anything. But basically, the combination of those, like a credit scoring model, will result in a number that gives you the likelihood that this person is below the poverty line. And that allows us, even with all of the kind of limitations of that, it allows us a robust enough measure for using a measure across the portfolio. And what it helps us do is it helps MFIs and other organizations understand their poverty outreach relative to a national or official poverty line. And then it helps not just the MFI, but stakeholders and investors like Oiko Credit understand how these organizations reach poor households. And then if you include and correlate these poverty scores, poverty estimates, with other kinds of client-level data, for example, repayment data, then you'll be able to do some kind of cluster analysis. And based on that, you can start designing better products for different types of subgroups within the poor households. I think one of the main pitfalls that most people will have if they're not careful in thinking about the poor is to think of the poor as being a homogeneous group and that one type of product fits everybody. What we're seeing is not only that there are subgroups or subclusters within what we call the poor households, but that these needs also evolve over time. So to be able to come up with a suite of products and services that are appropriate for certain groups at certain stages of their evolution in financial stability, that I think is one of the great challenges before us. So next slide, please. So this is a study that we conducted in the Philippines. Basically, we've been working with Philippine MFIs for about 3 years. Many of them are OICO credit partners collecting PPI scores. And they basically told us, look, we've been collecting PPI scores. What do we do with them? And so we decided, okay, then let's look at the kinds of outreach that we're seeing. And the first thing that we realized was that when you're looking at poverty outreach, it's not multidimensional in much the same way that poverty is not multidimensional. And what we're seeing here is these two maps. One on the left is the incidence of poverty in the Philippines, incidence being the percentage of poor people within a given province. And then the right side is the magnitude of poverty, just the total number of poor people within each province. And what we're seeing is that these are fairly two different pictures. The ones that are the provinces with the highest incidence are not necessarily the ones that have the highest magnitude. And in retrospect, this is actually quite understandable or not surprising. Usually, the ones with the highest incidence are the rural, remote areas. And where you have the high magnitude are those who are the urban centers, where you have large slum communities. But as a percent, because of the total number of people in those urban centers, these poor households as a percentage are smaller, but just in terms of total number, they outweigh most of the other provinces. So given these two dimensions of poverty, we felt that, next slide please, we should also have multiple or at least two dimensions in looking at the poverty outreach of microfinance institutions. And so we have, on one hand, concentration, which is the total number of poor people in an MFI's portfolio. So number of poor MFI clients over the total number of MFI clients. Because the fact is, not all of the borrowers of a microfinance institution live below the poverty line. Then on the flip side, you have scale, which is just the total number of poor microfinance clients within their portfolio of one MFI. And what we're seeing is that similarly, the ones with a high concentration are not necessarily the ones with a large scale, and vice versa. The ones with a large scale will not necessarily be the ones with the highest concentration. And then we also push this notion a bit and try to standardize scale, because scale will usually be dependent on just how big the microfinance institution is in general. So between an MFI that has 30,000 borrowers and an MFI that has 1 million borrowers, then it's fairly obvious that the one with 1 million will have more poor people in general. But then how then can we kind of standardize it so that you can meaningfully compare small MFIs with large MFIs? And so what we did was we looked at the total number of poor clients of that MFI in a particular province, and then divided it with the total number of poor households that we know in that province. So basically, if you look at the subsegment of poor household in that province, what portion of that subpopulation is this particular MFI serving. So it's more like an indicator of market share for that poor household market. So that's what we refer to as penetration. Next slide, please. So when we look at concentration of poverty outreach for the Philippines, what we're seeing is that for the most part, these 10 microfinance institutions are just slightly above the national distribution of poor people. So when you look at the leftmost column, that is the distribution of poor people in the Philippines, the country in general. So about 31% of the entire Philippine population is poor. And then if you look at the microfinance A, B, C, D until H, you will see certain variations. Microfinance A and H are pretty high compared to the others, 39% and 40%, which means there's several percentage points above the national average. And then you have MFIs B and C, for example, which are significantly below. The question is, why are we comparing it to the national average? Because the idea here is that if you are targeting the poor, then in general, you should be higher than the average for the area that you're working in. Otherwise, you can just, in principle, in theory, you can just randomly select people and end up kind of hitting the same average that the province or the country or the area will have. And so theoretically, you should be either at or above the national average. And what we're seeing here is that there are some MFIs that are not even there. Next slide, please. However, we should be very nuanced about this. It doesn't mean that since a good majority, not that majority of the clients of an MFI are not living below the poverty line, it doesn't mean that they are serving rich people. Because what we are looking at in the previous slide is a poverty line based on the national poverty line, which in this legend you'll see is between $1.25 a day and $2.50 a day. So usually $1.25 is what's considered ultra poor or extremely poor. Usually $2.50 is what is considered the kind of average poverty line. But there are other poverty lines around $375 a day and $5 a day. Clearly, it's not as destitute as those below $1.25, but it's still a very difficult existence to live on $5 a day. And what we're seeing here is that most of the borrowers of these microfinance institutions are below $5 a day, if not below $3.75 a day. So we want to be very clear that even though majority of the borrowers are not below the national poverty line, these are still serving what we call the vulnerable poor, which is poor households that might not be below the poverty line and probably just slightly above, but usually it only takes one medical emergency or one work layoff before they go below the poverty line. And it's not a very static picture. Usually they go up and down the poverty line, and it's usually that kind of volatility which causes a lot of stress in their life, in their households. Next slide, please. On the other hand, you will see this picture on the scale of poverty outreach. And what we'd like to point out is that we need to look at both sides of the story. What we're seeing here is that MFIs C and D, the ones with the low concentrations in the concentration slides, far outnumber the other MFIs in terms of the total number of borrowers, poor borrowers served in the country. So we should be very careful about saying, oh, MFI H, because it reaches 40% poverty concentration, is the best MFI in terms of social performance. You can see in this study, MFIH does not even register around 4,000 poor households in total, even though their intensity of the poor people in the portfolio is higher. You will see on the other hand, but together, MFI-C and D have about 200,000 borrowers, poor borrowers, although their concentrations were below average in the other slide. Which one is better? I think that is not a good question. I think what's important is to say, okay, these are two dimensions of poverty outreach, and that all MFIs should find a good balance towards scale and concentration. Next slide, please. Now, beyond that, we wanted to see, let's move away from your portfolio and look at how you are performing in each province that you are serving, and say how much of that poor population within that province are you actually touching, are you actually serving. And so we looked at, in this table before you, the provinces with the highest penetration, and on the right, the provinces with the lowest penetration. You can see two very interesting things. Number one, even in the provinces with the highest penetration, we're not reaching more than 20% of the poor households. Not 20% of the population, but the 20% of the poor households. So there are a lot of other poor households that we are not reaching in the Philippines for microfinance. And on the right side, what you're seeing is that there are some provinces where we don't even have any meaningful presence. And what's interesting is that most of these provinces that you see on the right where you don't have a presence are very rural, remote provinces. And in retrospect, that is not surprising, because microfinance is a very high-touch business. Low amounts, frequent collection, loan officer visits the center meetings every week, and so it will naturally gravitate towards areas with high population densities, where, for example, you can go from one center meeting to another in 30 minutes. But if you're going to serve remote rural communities where it takes half a day to go from one center meeting to another, then it's going to be very expensive for you to break even in your operations. Many of the MFIs in the Philippines need to subsidize their rural operations with their urban operations. And as you scale up, then you'll be able to do that better. But if you're a small MFI, then it's going to be more difficult for you to be able to do that. So it is not surprising. In retrospect, it's still a tragic situation, but you can understand why we have very little presence in these remote communities. But what's also interesting, you'll see in the next slide, please. So this one is basically same, just kind of graphical form of the table on the right on the previous slide, where we have the highest poverty incidence provinces, usually the ones that are most remote and rural, and you can see 0%, 2%, 4% penetration there. Next slide, please. But this is where we're seeing another interesting story, which is when you look at the provinces with the highest poverty magnitude, many of these provinces, not all, but some of them, are actually urban areas where you have high density areas. Cebu, for example, is the major metropolis in the Visayas region, which is in the middle of the country. There are about 170,000 poor households there, and only 6% of those poor households are being served in Cebu. So in other provinces like Maguindanao on the rightmost, where you see 0, as we said earlier, you can understand why there's not a lot of penetration because it's remote and rural. But in Cebu, where there is high urban, very dense population, it should be not as expensive to serve. Why is it that 94% of the poor do not have microfinance services? So these are some of the questions that the data revealed to us. And we went through a series of conversations with the MFIs to ask why that is. We have some ideas from them. They shared very insightful things, but we don't have data to prove that. So that's going to be the next phase of the study. But some of the insights are quite interesting. So next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is that we have, in general, low penetration of poverty outreach, despite the fact that in the Philippines, we have a fairly mature microfinance market. In some communities in Metro Manila, you will have 20, 30 MFIs competing against each other in those small communities. But yet, if you take a broad view, you are seeing very low penetrations. So what's happening here? What are we missing in the picture? I think what you're seeing earlier is that, one, if you break down between urban and rural, you will see that kind of preference, tendency to serve the urban communities or the high-density communities. But as we said, even in some of the urban communities, why is it that there are a lot of people who are not being served? Here, in the interviews with the MFIs, they talked about what they call the entrepreneurial poor, or so what sometimes people call the economically active poor. And so here what we're seeing again is that we're starting to understand subsegments within what we're calling the poor households. And what we're seeing is that there are some, at least in the minds of the MFI, there are some poor households who are probably not a good fit for a micro-enterprise loan. Now, take a step back. It actually makes sense on some level when you kind of look at it on second reflection, because many of the migrants to urban communities migrate primarily because they're looking for a job. Many people, whether poor or not, would not necessarily want to become an entrepreneur and would rather have a job, particularly if these are poor households who don't have very high skill levels. And so we need to start kind of breaking out the households that are more likely to want to be employed and households who want to be more likely to be self-employed. Now, the big question in terms of social performance is, if you look at the subset of those who want to be self-employed, who want to be entrepreneur, but they're poor, are they able to get the credit or capital or the services that they're getting from microfinance institutions? And now the question is, are the membership requirements of these microfinance institutions inclusive and are able to provide the people who want it with the services that they need, or are they setting themselves up for a higher level of requirement such that people who want it are not able to get it? So let me flesh it out with some examples. In the Philippines, because of the desire to have a larger share of the market, many MFIs, as a matter of kind of efficiency in risk management, only lend to women who have an existing business. They're no longer lending to women who want to start a business. Number two, they normally lend to women who will have a co-guarantor, which means usually that this is another member of the household who will be employed and who will have the kind of cash flow to kind of guarantee the money. Number three, they usually start with a loan size of 5,000 pesos. So if a woman needs only 2,000, 3,000, she is unlikely to get a loan. So these are practices that have evolved over time because many of the MFIs find that these are kind of the types of women who are more likely to repay the loans. So in many ways, it's a risk management move on their end. But that's where you have the trade-off between financial sustainability and social performance. In the process, you are systematically screening out these poor households who don't have an existing business, who don't have co-guarantors, and who don't need 5,000 pesos or $100 roughly, 120 roughly, as startup capital. So these are some of the practices that have evolved, and now we're kind of, through this study, kind of pushing the MFIs and saying, why are we doing this? I mean, maybe, so it's good, but you are developing these practices for risk management, but use the same kind of attention, energy, and intelligence to develop different products, different features, different distribution channels for the women who don't fit into those requirements, so that you'll be able to serve the others. Second point, or third point here, is that again, what you're seeing here is a mismatch between the type of product that microfinance offers and some of the actual cash flow needs of the remaining unserved poor. A disproportionate number of the poor but are not being served by microfinance institutions are live in rural remote communities, and most of them are agricultural households. Now, there's a big difference here. The urban households that do micro-enterprise lending well, the secret of microfinance has, again, always been small amounts, frequent collection, lend to women, groups of women. But when you're looking at agricultural households, the cash flows are very different. You need large amounts upfront to pay for the fertilizers, to pay for the seeds, and then from the time that they planted until harvest, they don't actually have any cash flow. So right from the start, there is this disconnect between the cash flow needs of the poor and the types of the features of the microenterprise loan that most MFIs are offering. And so because of that, what we're seeing is that almost systematically, we don't have the right operations or adequate levels of operations in these low population density areas. Last slide, please. So based on this, we kind of suggested, okay, these are different ways by which we can help MFIs improve poverty outreach. Number one, they should start measuring. Many MFIs, say that they don't need to measure because they are serving, they are operating in poor areas, and therefore they must be hitting poor people. But it's not necessarily the case, and so they still need to measure. They don't need to use the PPI, but they need to use something. But the instrument that they use needs to be indexed towards an official poverty line. Otherwise, they will only be able to serve, kind of get data relevant to a particular area, and they won't be able to compare or to analyze across areas. And we noticed that the MFIs that use the PPI, but in addition also identified a clear cutoff score. They basically, one MFI, for example, said they told their loan officers, for every 100 new borrowers you're going to recruit this month, 80% of them should have a score no higher than 34 in the poverty scorecard. And if you're going to include beyond 80, that 80%, somebody with a higher score, then they must fall under these very strict exception rules. And that is the way for you to actually use the scorecard methodically. Most MFIs, even though they use the PPI, they basically just recruit the way they normally do and only just get the profiles afterwards. And they get an idea of how their portfolio looks like. And then they start wondering, why aren't we hitting our targets? And then we say, well, you never really tried to do any kind of meaningful targeting. You just lend to anybody who wants. So there's a certain amount of discipline that is required here in order to meet your targets, but that discipline really rests upon using a particular tool that's accurate. Number two, you need to understand and develop appropriate products and delivery systems for the non-entrepreneurial poor and for the rural and agricultural households, as we discussed earlier. And then lastly, we should consider when expanding, you're looking for new expansion areas, MFIs should start thinking about both the poverty incidence and the poverty magnitude. And in the map that we showed earlier, you can actually see spots. Unfortunately, there are areas where you have high incidence and high magnitude. And so those are really tragic situations, but they're also probably some of the more high potential growth areas for microfinance institutions. So thank you very much. I'll stop there and see if there are questions.
Happy, thank you so much. This webinar was actually the third installment of our Microfinance Investor Education Series that Oiko Credit USA launched about poverty outreach. And for those of you who are unaware, we have two blogs posted. One is an interview with Steve Wright, who's the Social Performance Director of Grameen Foundation, and one with Chris Lomboy, who is a colleague of Happy's in the Philippines, who talked about implementation of PPI. And I want to begin by asking a question, and then I'll open up the lines and I'll allow people to ask questions. But one of the things that Steve talked about in his blog, or his interview rather, was how important it was when you're trying to target poverty, to measure poverty, which is something that you just mentioned. And then both he and Chris talked about, in order for PPI to be successful as far as implementation, that it really has to be well understood and well accepted by all levels of a microfinance institution. So that includes the CEO, the board, and then also the loan officers who are doing the implementation often and actually going and asking the questionnaires. So I'm curious if you can give us a sense, Happy, given that this is probably the first time that any kind of quantitative analysis was done for a lot of these MFIs. What were some of the reactions that you received from the MFIs once they saw these results?
Interesting question. Okay, I have to beg your pardon because for some reason there are fireworks outside. So if you're hearing those, I apologize. We actually had the benefit of having engaged these MFIs in an ongoing conversation about their poverty outreach for about 3 years. Some 2 years, most 3 years, and many of them through the program officers of Oiko Credit, because we trained the Oiko Credit officers to do that. So when they actually saw the findings of the study, it was not too surprising for them. It's something that they already knew. However, let's step back 2-3 years before, and there you'll see all sorts of interesting conversations. You would like to think that many MFIs would embrace a tool such as the PPI. But basically what we're seeing is that initially they resisted it, particularly when they find out that a majority of their borrowers don't live below the poverty line. It's not the kind of picture that most MFIs want to kind of project to the world. We get a lot of MF people excited about using the PPI and saying, oh, this is a wonderful tool, it will help us tell our story. But the underlying assumption there is that the story is going to be positive. And right from the start, we tell them, you have to be very careful about this because maybe you won't be able to handle the truth. And a lot of times, particularly those that don't target, they see that it's actually lower than they expected. And then you'll start this conversation about people looking at the individual indicators and saying, oh, that's not valid, that is not valid, poor people don't have televisions. What if the television was actually given to them by somebody else and they didn't buy it? And we have to keep on telling them that, look, this is a probability model. The individual indicators don't mean much in terms of the overall result. What you need to look at is the overall picture. So you have those kinds of conversations across the institution. And then you realize that um, within the institution, different levels of the organizations have kind of different levels of abstracting the information. And by that I mean a lot of managers and senior managers of the MFI, their tendency is to look at the portfolio broadly. And that's why, in many ways, these things, ratios mean to them, even though sometimes they don't like what they're seeing. It's at least meaningful. But a lot of the ongoing resistance that we're experiencing comes from frontline loan officers. And basically for two reasons. One, they perceive this as additional work. So I already have a very heavy caseload. Why are you adding work to what I'm doing? It's another 10 minutes that I really don't have, and then we have to encode this. Over time, though, they see that this is a very simple tool to use. But what's more problematic for them is this notion that I think, based on what I see regarding the home of this particular person, that she is actually poor. And yet, when I run the score, it's actually higher than what we say would be poor. And there is this tension that we have created there. And in part because loan officers basically don't look portfolio-wide. Rather, they, and bless their heart for doing this, they look at individual members and say, okay, this woman really deserves to be a member of our organization. Why is this tool preventing me from giving her that opportunity? So those are some of the tensions that we're seeing. And that's why we were very clear, and we made a mistake here before about not controlling the interpretation of this scores well. Number one, when the MFIs started seeing low concentration numbers, the discussion about mission drift started. And we thought that, oh, that was bad. That should not have happened, because really it all depends on the market and the strategy of the MFI. And we should not be heavy-handed in judging them to be not a good social performance MFI. Number two, we needed to create more latitude in terms of exception rules, which we did not articulate beforehand when we were having these conversations. So individual loan officers can still advocate for certain borrowers, even though their PPI scores might be higher because of certain exceptions that the MFI has predetermined. So that gives us a better sense of standardized common standards among the MFI for judging poverty status, but at the same time giving them enough flexibility to really advocate for people that they think are deserving members.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to other questions. If you do have a question, you can use the raise hand function on the GoToMeeting dashboard, or you can simply type your question into the chat window and send it to me. So are there any questions? I'm not seeing any questions. I would encourage everybody to visit our blog, which is oicocreditusa.org/blog, and see the Microfinance Investor Education Series, which discusses the overall role of PPI as far as measuring poverty, and then the implementation of PPI from an MFI perspective. Happy, I want to thank you so much for taking the time this evening to speak to us, and I hope that the celebration continues where you are. I heard the fireworks. Oh, wait, I'm seeing one question here, and I want to pick it up. I think we will have one question, it looks like, from one of our investors in Seattle. And this is from Rick Hodgson. He says, what changes are you seeing? Is PPI actually, he's asking, what changes are you seeing that PPI is actually creating for microfinance?
Sure. Let me kind of give specific examples, and then I think we can try to abstract it a bit. One clear example we had, and this is with an Oiko Credit investee, was that when they were first doing the PPI, they basically made a decision that we're not going to do targeting. We're just going to look at profiles. We're just going to see how our borrowers within our portfolio are stacking up in terms of poverty distribution. Then the results came, and this is an MFI that has won all sorts of awards for social performance, and we think that they are really good in terms of social performance. But when the results came out, they were very low in terms of poverty concentration. And not only were they low compared to the others, but they were kind of significantly several percentage points lower than the average of the other MFIs in this study. And they did not know why. So one was we knew that they weren't targeting, so that was fairly easy. But there are other MFIs that were not targeting, and so but they were lower than those. And so there must be something systemic that was happening. And then we looked at their individual provinces, and we saw that across the board they were doing that. And so we engaged in a discussion where, okay, what might be happening here? And then we realized that many of them were requiring all sorts of other guarantees for their loans. So that, and again, in their minds, that was something to help manage risk. But because of that, they were systematically ending up serving people who have slightly higher poverty scores. And so they decided to review their requirements and become more deliberate, and then they removed that. And then we heard about 2 months ago that they have decided to do a targeting strategy. So they now have decided to pick a particular poverty score, and they are going to require their loan officers to make sure that a certain percentage of all of their new borrowers are below that score. So those are some of the kind of very straightforward operational changes that we're seeing MFIs do because of the PPI. And that's actually an important thing for us, because we don't want them to just have a report that they post on their web or they, worse, keep in their filing cabinet. We want the information to become business intelligence. We want this information for them to be making decisions for the workload of their loan officers, for how they allocate resources going forward. So that is a good example of what we're seeing. Hope there are some others, like in one of the larger MFIs, where they're starting to do cluster analysis. And so what they're seeing is that among all of their borrowers, they divide them into specific poverty bands. So those who are 80% likely to be poor, 60% likely to be poor, 40% likely to be poor. And then they compare the financial performance of those borrowers, whether it is repayment or the increases in the balance of their savings accounts. And so the usual bias that we see with MFIs is that they would think that the people with higher PPI scores would be more likely to pay or repay and more likely to have higher savings balances. But what we're seeing as a result of the study was that people with very low PPI scores are sometimes better, are the same, if not better, than many of the higher PPI score clusters in terms of repayment and in terms of savings balances. And this is interesting because there was this one MFI that before was using a kind of cash flow analysis to recruit clients. And so they ended up getting higher PPI scores because they thought they would get repaid better. But what they didn't realize was this. People with higher PPI scores tend to live in the more urban areas, and people in the more urban areas tend to have access to multiple MFIs. And so on one hand, they were looking at capacity to pay, but they were not looking at the willingness to pay. And so there was a kind of moral hazard issue happening there where people who felt that they had more options did not take the opportunity to borrow money from that MFI as seriously as the poorer people in remote areas where there are not a lot of options. And so they stopped that move. They went back to, they stopped using cash flow analysis in terms of recruitment. They still do cash flow analysis, but it's no longer a criteria for membership. And then they looked at the PPI, and then they focused on poor people with very low PPI scores. And they've grown significantly, and their repayments have improved. So those are some of kind of the interesting micro changes that we're seeing. And hopefully over time, more and more people will see the value of this, and we will start doing a little more analysis regarding segmentation studies and how we can do product development as a result of that, and then double bottom line analysis, not for individuals, but for the institution, whether MFIs that are outreach are also as sustainable as MFIs that don't have good outreach. And then we want to do also poverty movement analysis and see whether what's happening to the PPI scores of people who have been with the MFI for 2, 3, 4 years. And I'm sure that in the process of doing that, we will learn all sorts of new insights, which will then hopefully have similar changes to the individual MFIs like we're seeing in others.
That's a great answer, and it's fascinating to hear how it's being used to affect change. That's, as you say, ultimately the goal. Are there any other questions? Well, Happy, thank you very much for joining us. Oh, wait, sorry, one more question here. Okay, here's a question. Can you note some examples used in the PPI scoring in the Philippines? You mentioned the number of children under 14 in a household. Can you give some other examples?
Sure. Before I do that, I just want to say that the actual PPI scorecard with all of the questions are on the web. It's in the link that I sent you. You can see all that. But the other quick examples would be, what is the educational attainment of the female head of household? That is a very strong predictor of the likelihood that a household is poor. The materials that they use for the construction of the house, whether it is made of light material or kind of more heavy materials, that's a good indicator. And then another indicator would be, do they have a running indoor plumbing or some kind of sewer connection to the sewer system, or do they have an outhouse? And I raised that last point because that's actually a very, we train the loan officers in collecting information and making sure that the borrowers are providing accurate answers. Because sometimes the borrowers are anticipating the questions and think that, oh, I can't be so well off that I won't qualify. So sometimes we tell the loan officers, don't even ask the question. What you can do is just say, may I use your restroom? And then you can verify for yourself whether they have that running sewer or not. And same thing with most of the other questions. You can verify it for yourself without having to ask the women. But it's important for the loan officer to visit the house. And so that's kind of the discipline that we're instilling. Last point though, these indicators change not just from country to country because it depends on the National Poverty Survey that they're using, but from survey to survey. So you always have to update the survey, and usually in like a country in the Philippines, every 4 years they come up with a new survey. And usually the questions that are most predictive from one generation to another, they evolve. It's different. And the distribution of answers for each type of sub-answer or answer to these questions, they also change. And so the likelihood changes. And so it's an organic, evolving instrument. And you can't just you can't just say that, oh, okay, this is the perfect indicator and that's it. You need to be able to update it regularly.
Do you know off the top of your head how many countries for which Grameen Foundation has PPI questionnaires?
Last I read, there were 46 across the world.
Okay.
And not in all of those countries we have a presence. And so we need partners to make sure that there's a trusted practitioner on the ground that will help people use it. 46.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to end the webinar now, given that it's 11 o'clock your time, Happy, and we're at about time here. Thank you all for joining us and for the great questions and for your participation today. I have recorded this webinar, so if you're interested in receiving the recording or sharing it with others who are unable to make it, please send me an email. You can reach me at usa@oicocredit.org. Happy, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, and thanks for having us.
Absolutely. I encourage you all to visit the website progressoutofpoverty.org and to view this report, which the website's here, but I will also send an email and share it with you all. So thank you and have a great day. Take care.